Let me call to order the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency meeting for today, October 27th. Please rise for a Pledge of Allegiance. Supervisor Sargos, can you lead us? Please follow me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
Chair Malhart.
Here.
Director Craven. Here. Director Zaragoza.
Here.
Director Kelly.
Here.
Director Borchert.
Here. Okay, Sam McIntyre, Dan Nauman as alternates are here. I don't see any other alternates, so I think that takes care of that. Agenda review. Jeff.
One change for your board on item 8, attachment B, the resolution. You should have in front of you a revised sheet. The only thing that really changed was former item 12, which is now 13 on page 4 of 8B. It should have been red to indicate that it was a change made, and for some reason that didn't happen in your copy. So you've got the revised sheet in front of you. The word didn't change or anything, just the highlights did. Okay. And that's it.
All right. Dave, you okay with the order? Do you want to make a change? Okay. All right. The agenda is submitted. Any objections? Hearing none. Okay, we'll stay with the agenda. Public comments. Opportunity for the public to address the board on non-agendized items. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm Dale Zarowski with the Farm Bureau, and I just wanted to report that our new conditional waiver for agricultural discharges was passed on October 7th by the regional board. The vote was 5-0 in favor of a new waiver. We're very pleased with the results. It's basically essentially the same program that we've had over the last 5 years, which requires monitoring, BMP implementation, and reporting. The waiver is now part of TMDL implementation officially, and we did pick up a TMDL for toxaphene in the Santa Clara River watershed, which is new. Other than that, we have another 8 hours of educational credit that's going to be used to inform growers on how to meet compliance of regulatory compliance with the waiver. And let me see what else. That's it. We're once again pleased with it. We think the waiver program has been a success, and we think the regional board agrees with us in that they passed our new waiver 5-0. So that's the report.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? There are board member comments. I'd like to introduce Susan Mulligan. She is the new general manager of Kiegas. Susan, if you want to say anything, please come forward.
I don't have any prepared comments, but clearly groundwater basin issues are a big priority for Kiegas. making sure that we work towards some solutions in the Las Posas Basin, and look forward to working with the GMA and with all the other pumpers to make some progress.
Well, very good. We're pleased that you're here. This is your first meeting. We're going to try
It
to
is.
get through this one quickly, which will be a novelty for us. So
Okay.
it may actually be a false meeting because we actually, if I can do this right, we'll go fast because Dave needs to. No, yeah, well, I'm eating into that time now.
Okay.
You know, I'll just pass on to you that Kiegas has been a great partner for the county, for the GMA, for United, for all the water folks in the county. And the relationship that we have built over time has been significant, and it helps in solving our mutual water problems. And I look forward to working with you and the board as well and keeping that relationship going, because between all the water agencies that we have in the county right now, we seem to be all hitting the street, working on solving real problems and not fighting among ourselves. And so
Yeah.
Kiegas has been very helpful in that process, and we're appreciative of it.
We will keep that up. We all need each other.
Very good. So anyway, congratulations on your job. You've got a big problem, a big process. Problem in front of you. Excuse me.
Thank you. Drink the water.
Susan? I'm John Zaragoza.
Oh, yes.
And I was with the City of Oxnard for many, many, many
Oh,
years
yes, I
as
know.
a council member, so welcome, and I know you were there too as a staff member, so congratulations on your new position.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Very good. Even without problems, right?
Even without problem.
Very good. Okay, any other board member have any comments? Okay, we have a consent item, which is item 1. It's approval of minutes.
Move the approval.
Second. A motion and a second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, opposed, hearing none, one person abstained. Okay, next item is informational items, and it's kind of the same speech I gave at the last meeting, and I'm going to try to do this. And our staff does such a great job, and I don't want to shortchange the staff, but at the same time, I want to make sure that we move on to the action items. So, and I've had this conversation with Jeff and others. I think the intent of the information items is to cover the highlights, and if somewhere in the process we touch a nerve and we have to go into detail, we'll make the time to go in detail. But we all have the agenda packet. We've moved our way through, and I think it's the only area that I can cut a lot of time out so we can get to the action items, which really requires some board thought and decision making. So with that, Brian.
Okay, well, duly noted. For the record, Brian Bondi with United Water and the GMA, and item 2 is our routine update on the Las Posas Basin specific plan. This item actually had been on consent for a number of months. We moved it to information to provide an opportunity for discussion on, board member discussion on the status of the basin planning effort, and more specifically Emergency Ordinance D. Taking to heart what you just said, Chair Mulhart, I won't go through and recap the board letter. It's before you. If there's any questions, please do bring them up. But specifically, the issue for discussion was Emergency Ordinance D. It does expire at the end of the year, and staff and agency council have reviewed the matter, and we're of the opinion that no further extensions should be recommended from staff's perspective. The issue is whether or not this is an emergency condition anymore. We've looked at the information that we've received. We've received only one request for a well permit. There's only been 1 out of 57 applicants for irrigation efficiency who exceeded the 4 acre-feet per acre cap. So the idea here is that, and we talked about this at the users group meeting this morning, if there's a desire on the part of Kiegas and the users group to continue with the limitations that are included in Emergency Ordinance D, it's staff's recommendation to look at other options. And basically the other options would be adopting a regular ordinance, because this is a long-term process that we are now seeing. We've been this in 20 months now. Or to amend the ordinance code. Either option would achieve the same goal. There are other considerations. Talking with council today, we'd probably want to see some form of a reopener, a trigger to relook at what we've done in this ordinance change. or ordinance that's adopted to take a look at it. And certainly when the basin plan is completed and rolled into the agency's ordinance code, that would be a perfect opportunity to relook at things. So that's really the issue at hand. There were users this morning that expressed desire to continue with some of the limitations that are in Emergency Ordinance D, and so we would like your board feedback. And pending your feedback, pending that feedback, we do intend to work with Cayugas and the users group to come to some agreement on what we should do moving forward.
Okay. Since at the users group, Dave, Mike, were you there this morning? No. Do you have any comments about a sense of should we let it expire, or that apparently there were some comments that people wanted to reissue it?
Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought we finished with that you were going to try to compile this rather than just go off the comments which were made today. Is that not true, or what did you feel our direction was?
I sense that there was a general consensus that trying to keep the aspects of Emergency Ordinance D that pertain to expansion of groundwater use, particularly on previously unirrigated land,
right,
was the focus of what folks wanted to try and preserve. The issue from staff's perspective and speaking of conversations with council is that those are on the table. The issue is the vehicle, and the vehicle of an emergency ordinance is what our concern is.
Right.
Defending the emergency conditions relative to other parts of the basin is becoming increasingly difficult.
Okay.
The majority of everybody there was sympathetic with proceeding as a regular ordinance, but
Okay.
I was still waiting for somebody to violently object.
Okay. Let me do this. Anybody in the audience want to speak on this? Yes, sir.
Henry Gromlich, Cayugas Municipal Water District. I just want to confirm that at today's Las Posas users group, the users requested that we convey to the GMA an interest in finding some way to address expansion of water use in previously undeveloped lands. In particular, the process has convinced all of the parties that groundwater is limited within the Las Posas basins, and that expansion of use is ultimately going to result in reduced availability of that resource for existing users. And your executive officer, Jeff Pratt, was at the meeting and took note of some of the ideas, and we're ready to work with GMA staff and council to find a way to carry those forward absent the emergency ordinance, and propose as revisions to the GMA ordinance code.
Okay, very good. Sir, do you want to speak?
My name is Raymond Arroesti. I own a property on Bradley Road in Somas. We have 22 acres of avocados. It's been almost 2 years we've been considering putting a well in. In the last year, we've seen our water costs go up 60% with District 19, from approximately $500 an acre foot to over $800 an acre foot right now. That increase has made continuing our production of avocados economically unfeasible. In light of the fact that there is we have not heard any extraordinary reason for continuing the emergency measure, I would submit to you that the burden placed on myself, I may be the only person that's looking to put in a well right now, but the burden upon me outweighs the burden to the district in light of the fact that they have failed to meet, I think, their threshold by establishing some extraordinary reason why the measure should be continued.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thanks, sir. Anybody else? All right. So the staff's recommendation is to let the ordinance expire, move on with the process. So as a staff direction, let's move on with the process of doing the modifications as necessary to make it a permanent change to the ordinance. That's the recommendation I'm hearing. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Do we have, Mike.
Mr. Zaragoza, you're going through the process of hillside ordinances at the board, and what do you see in your current level of that new and undeveloped properties are largely hillside properties, and will your ordinance inhibit that, leave it as is, disable it totally? What do you think will be the effect of the hillside ordinances on further ag development?
Hopefully, I hope it doesn't hinder it, because, I support ag, as mentioned before in the board, but I don't think it'll hinder it. That's my belief, and I think that we should work with that ordinance and the individuals that are going to develop as we progress. So I don't see it as a hindrance.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make sure the gentleman who spoke understood that this is an information item and we're not really taking action today. This will come back to us as an action item, and perhaps somebody could notify him when it will be on our agenda.
Well, I think the question is, do we want to put it on the agenda? Because for us to extend the emergency ordinance, we have to direct staff to put it on the agenda for the December meeting. Is that correct?
Yes. Our intention is to put it on there anyway.
Oh, okay. To put it on there, but the recommendation that we're hearing is that when it comes time, we'll not extend it.
But I thought I heard somebody say to move forward and make changes to the ordinance code so it would be, something would be permanent, and at that time he might want to speak.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
When you put it on the agenda, this issue on the agenda, are you going to agendize it to deal with emergency ordinance, possibility of extending the emergency ordinance, and/or asking for staff direction on changing the permanent order? How are you going to do that?
We're going to do both of those things in the agenda item.
Okay.
We'll make recommendations on ordinance D, and we'll make recommendations on modifications as discussed at the LPUD.
Okay. Does that answer that question then?
So we can just tell him that will be on the December agenda?
It will be on, and that meeting's 12/1.
That's the 1st of December, because it's not the regular day in December.
12/1?
12, yeah, 12/1. It's a Wednesday.
Okay.
We talked about it here.
Yeah, but I thought okay, I won't be here for that meeting.
No, you said you would.
Ms. Craven makes a wonderful
Yeah.
monitor.
So if I'm out here, I'm not here. Okay. So that'll be the direction of staff, all right, as an informational item. Okay? Any other questions on that? Okay. Let's go to item number 2.
Item number 3 is
3. I'm sorry.
board requested update on the SAG process related to the credits issue. Again, this is a follow-up from our July study session and September study session on the credits issue. The board direction to staff and SAG was to schedule a meeting, develop a process and a schedule for making recommendations back to the board. And the second piece of the direction to staff was to basically reach out to growers and small mutuals. We did all of those things. Our outreach consisted of an agency newsletter and working with the Ventura County Ag Association and the Farm Bureau to get the message out to growers, and also working with Zone Mutual to get the message out to the mutuals. And that worked very well. We had 2 to 3 times the normal attendance of the typical SAG meeting, and most of the additional people were made up of growers and mutuals. So it worked nicely, and we can use that process in the future. I'll spare, in the interest of time, I won't summarize the meeting other than to say that we framed the issues, we provided background information, there was some preliminary feedback from the SAG members to the order that we want to look at moving forward, not look at the past credit accumulation. Let's focus on policies that deal with the use of the credits. Let's leave the credits that are there alone. That was sort of the summary of the general consensus. We agreed that to bring back additional level of detail on the background information. There were some very specific requests to do a detailed analysis of the last 4 to 5 years. So that'll be brought back at the next meeting, and hopefully at that point there'll be enough information for folks to start working through potential policy recommendations. In terms of the schedule, there were some comments that this should take no more than 1 or 2 meetings, so the preliminary look is that this is going to be a quick process, and we're hoping to have something by March for the board.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? All right.
And when's the next meeting scheduled, Brian?
The next meeting is, I believe,
November 17th, 3 to 5, same location.
quicker to the draw. That's
Okay.
all I have on that item, unless there's any questions or comments.
Okay. All right, let's go to item 4.
Before I start, this item is actually rather lengthy. I don't know if you want to reorient the order of the items, but this was something we were hoping to get through today. I don't know how much time we have. This is probably a 20 to 30 minute
Okay.
presentation.
Let's do this, if everybody's okay with that. Let's hold that one so we can get down to the action items, and then we'll come back to that one. Let's do item 5.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. For the record, Gerard Kapusick, Watershed Protection District and agency staff. This morning or this afternoon, in the interest of time and the chair's direction, we'll do a very high-level overview of this item. There's no decision being requested of you today other than preliminary to begin a 2-month process of review and comment and finalization, with this item coming back to the board in January for your consideration and adoption. So I'm going to move through this as quickly as I can. Essentially, we just want to talk a little bit about overview, ground ourselves in the elements, share with the board the work team, give an overview of the structure of the proposed manual, and then using a series of flowcharts, I think, will make the key elements of the manual come alive, and then summarize next steps and answer any questions you might have. Essentially, just to ground the board, we requested your board back in May of 2009 to authorize us to, over a period of a couple of fiscal years without interrupting other priority work plan tasks, sort of streamline, update, and make the business manual, business practices manual, and administrative policies manual more usable, more user-friendly, and more alive. Your board agreed and designated this as a core work task in the fiscal 9-10 and 10-11 plan, but you also told us this is not something that is to compete with other high priority tasks. We will do it and fit it in as best we can, and we've tried to do that. We originally anticipated coming back to your board in June. Obviously, we've slipped a little bit on this, given the level of effort on some of the other tasks. I think that's understandable, but we are presenting today an initial first cut decision draft, primarily to get your feedback and reaction and provide a time frame for you, stakeholders, members of the public, at your direction in whatever organized fashion you wish, to give us feedback on the manual. Essentially, the intent of the manual was to meet a 3-part test, to comply with all of the agency's statutory business practice standards, to meet the operation needs as your board establishes them in the budget, the work plan, and in direction, and to facilitate amongst the work team and amongst the broader stakeholders efficient and collaborative administration of those areas. Essentially, our tasks were to review and evaluate what we have. We're not starting from ground zero. We're going to preserve what we think is best from a standpoint of process, subject to your review. We need to clarify some business practices as your board has tasked us to do additional things in the work plan. The previous versions of the manuals and processes that we've had predated the work plan. There's a lot of effort that your board authorized in the work plan that has to be incorporated, so we try to integrate that. And it's very important from the standpoint of staff's perspective that all of the team members, and remember we have a variety of folks working on things in order to distribute the work and provide focus of effort and efficiency, have clear rules of engagement. So this is an effort to try to do that as best we can. The team that was tasked to bring this to your board is identified, led with our esteemed clerk, Miranda Nobriga, who is sort of at ground zero of the intersection of all these administrative processes. Our institutional memory resident, Dave Panaro, who has been with the agency the longest of the three of us, and provides the context and content. And I do want to point out that the charts that we'll see here in a few minutes were of Dave's creative creation and are very helpful, and myself. Essentially, we've identified the structure of the manual to cover what we consider to be the must-dos
before we get into the issues of what we'd like to do or potentially could do. And the table of contents pretty well does that, at least from our perspective. What we found through this process is the trade-off between, if you want to have it all in a one document, it can get very large very fast. At the same time, we have ability now with hot linking and websites and reference documents to condense that. And the draft that you have here today is fairly large. It's a little bit larger than we had hoped. About half of that is reference documents, and as we work through this, we're going to try to find a better way to deal with that. And I think when we get to a further chart, we'll identify this. But essentially, Section 1 covers the essential ground rules, the statutory authority, the vision and mission that your board adopts, our bylaws, and the actual processes that the board and the staff works under. Section 2 is devoted primarily to the board meetings, the protocols, the engagement, the roles and responsibilities as defined both in statute, ordinance, your board policies. Again, this chart pretty well lays out the key elements of those. Section 3 is, and again, these charts, as I said, were created by Dave, is a great structural organization chart. I apologize for the stick figures getting a little fat as we widen this graphic. It sort of attenuated that, but we'll work on those kinds of things as we refine it. But I think it provides a good graphical description for everyone, including those that don't live, breathe, and eat this stuff the way we do, of what we do and how we do it amongst the folks. I would point out, and I had to take a little bit of constructive criticism from my dear colleague, Brian Bondi, because we've left him out of this chart. So that's my fault.
It's a draft.
Well, that's what I tried, but he didn't accept that as an initial discussion. So, but we'll arm wrestle that to the ground. So you can see this is a work in progress, sausage making, and the full version of all of us here. So.
You know, I think that what you were trying to do was make it so we couldn't read that up there, and we can't read what's here because the print is so very, very small, and none of us would have ever noticed if you hadn't said that.
I wish I was that bright. But no, actually it's a work in progress. Section 4 deals with how the agency engages in consultant and vendor contracts beyond the staff public works charges. This is the largest part of our budget, and there needs to be clear rules of engagement. We looked at the county's process, and we took the best from it, but your agency is not constrained by that. You are, however, constrained by certain quality by selection standards in state law, which is usually what's used to select consultants under law, and this process that's identified in the manual does that. Section 5 is just an overview of our financial management, and on the left side there are two critical documents: the annual work plan, which defines the task, level of effort, estimate, and costs of the public works charges, the folks that are here working, and that is the lion's share of the budget, and then of course the budget document. We have the quarterly performance budget monitoring reports, which allows your board to give us mid-course correction, review, and monitoring. There is and this actually says annual, but it's biannual audit preparation. We're in a biannual audit cycle this year, so you'll be having an audit report coming to you in February and March for the last 2 years, and then a series of fee and charge tables that will update as adjustments are made. It's important for the agency to document its role in project reviews under CEQA. In some cases, we are seldom the lead agency, but in many cases we are responsible party agencies in responding to groundwater management project components of larger land use components in the county, particularly in the unincorporated area. Now here's where it gets dicey. To balance out the heft of the work and the resource documents, this chart shows you all of the ordinances and resolutions, and actually the resolution table on the right needs to be updated with the more recent ones. So here's where we get complex, and here's why the second half of the manual from pages 30 on essentially is a recitation of this in a table. We need to be a little bit more efficient, at the same time not lose the ability to get this information. So we're exploring web-based hot links here with document management, but this gives kind of an interesting picture of the work products in ordinance and resolutions that this agency has churned out over the last 26 years. These are important reference documents, but they're not necessarily required to be in the full body of the manual itself. And we end up with glossary and index. which are obvious terms. So our next step is the presentation we're making to you now. Some preliminary off the cuff, and we recognize we just gave you this draft. Are we on the right track? We're going to publish the draft on the agency website by this Friday. The team that's mentioned, as well as the broader entire agency staff, will have refinement meetings over the next 2 months. We'd ask for written comments that your board may have individually or as a group by December, as well as any other stakeholder by the 31st. And if, assuming this is all met, we would revise the document and bring it back to you on January. In that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
First of all, appreciate the work that the team has put together in trying to meet the objectives of the board, and it obviously is a lot of work trying to formalize what we have effectively been doing by experience. So I appreciate the workload. The couple of comments I'd make is, given the fact that between now and December we only have one board meeting, I would change the written comment deadline to at least January of 11. I just push it out. With all the things we wind up doing at the last minute, the 11th hour, let's just give time. There's no sense of urgency that has to be done tomorrow. So if you want to make the deadline January or February, I'm okay with that. I don't know what others want.
How about if we establish the end of January and come back to you in February?
Yeah, you could do that, or make the end of February. So I don't see any harm of stretching it out. And I also believe that in the initial cut of this, as we get some experience with it, you guys will come back to us with modifications to it. So I don't think it has to be absolutely perfect first time out of the chute. It ought to be a working document that serves its purpose, and experience is the only thing that's going to tell us whether or not it does what we intended it to do. So if my opinion is, you can push out the public comments and the deadline and just push it out a little bit further. I have no problems with that. As far as the format and everything else, I'm fine with that. What do you guys want to do?
I don't have any comments, and I think it's good to move it because we have the holidays upon us, coming up, Thanksgiving and Christmas and all those holidays. So I think it's a good idea too.
It's probably not as big a priority on other people's agenda, so let's just give them more time to think about it. Right? Charlotte, you okay with that?
Hey, it took a year and a half to get here.
Yeah. You guys, anything? Okay. Anybody in the audience have any comments? Okay, thank you. All right, very good. Let's go to, we'll eventually come back to item 4. Let's go to item 6, please.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Mulhart, board members, members of the public. Gerhard Hubner, Deputy Director, Watershed Protection District. It's my pleasure to present this item number 6, which is a proposed resolution number 2010-7, a resolution establishing a tiered groundwater surcharge rate pursuant to our ordinance code. I have about 5 or 6 slides for you in this presentation today, so bear with me. I'll try and go through this fairly quickly. Historically, the GMA, as you recall, has tied its surcharge rates to Cayugas Municipal Water District's Tier 2 water rates. And that's because those Tier 2 water rates are set to recover imported water that Cayugas receives, potable water from the Municipal Water District of Southern California, or MAT. And currently our surcharge rate is set to that, and that rate is 1,105 acre-feet, dollars per acre-foot. As you recall, as we've gone through time and looked at this issue, in October of 1998, our surcharge was at $725. We revisited that issue again in 2008. The board at that time decided to raise it to $950. And in October of last year, we raised it to $1,150, and that became effective this January. So in today's item, and the analysis that we conducted, we have a proposed tiered rate for you to consider, and that's part of the resolution. If you look at the resolution and how we established it, it really came down to three items. First, it incorporates Cayugas Municipal Water District's Tier 2 rate as the baseline, essentially fixing it or tying it to that. It also proposes that there be an automatic adjustment each January of each year if Cayugas decides to change its Tier 2 rate. Then we looked at various tiering methods. And as you can imagine, there's various permutations that you could do. We also looked at the database and how that would affect the operators that are in surcharge mode. And I'll show a little bit of statistics in my next slide. But we essentially settled, after looking at various scenarios, of a proposed Tier 1, which essentially says anything 100% to 199% of historical allocation would fall within that tier. Then Tier 2 would be 200% or above to capture essentially the over-allocators or the over-pumpers, and that would be 200% or above, and they would be assessed the Tier 2 rate, which is $1,105, plus an additional increment of $500, setting it at $1,600 total. And that number we looked at and we researched what would it cost for new water, what essentially costs new water. If you had to do a desal facility, for example, brackish groundwater, what perhaps are some of the cost? Again, looking at research at other areas, you see a range of $1,600 to $2,000 in terms of what it would cost if we had to produce that new water. So that's the rationale with the Tier 2. Some of the conclusions, as we know, the cost and reliability of imported water continues to rise and remains uncertain as to its future availability. That's why we continue to revisit this issue. As I mentioned, the tiered rates account for the cost of new water versus what we historically have only said, what's the cost of imported water. It's important to remember that, this surcharge rate and this adjustment the intent was a disincentive, not necessarily a revenue generation, but a disincentive, change behavior so that ideally if we could have 0 people in surcharge, that's what our goal is. And then looking at the database, and we did a survey of the folks that are in the surcharge mode, or potential surcharge mode, and we don't know yet for this year because we don't have the record yet for this year to see if the $1,150 has been effective or not. We have to go to the 2009 database. And so we had 27 potentially. 18 of them would have the potential to file for IE. You take them aside. 4 would be in Tier 1, and 5 potentially would be in Tier 2. And even looking at the 5 in Tier 2, some of them, because they don't have allocation, it pushes their number a little higher, so there may even be less in the Tier 2 realm. So essentially we'd be capturing, with this tier system, 9 operators. So among options, at least we've identified 3 here, but there's various permutations that you could go, and trying to keep it simple. Could today just keep the status quo and retain the current surcharge rate. You could take the tiered surcharge rate, fix at the current Cayugas Municipal Tier 2 water rate, plus a $500 increment. Or option 3, the tiered surcharge rate automatically adjusted each year based on what Cayugas does, plus the $500 increment. And our recommendation, based on the analysis and what we presented to you in the board letter, is that you go with option 3, essentially have that tiered rate, 2 tiers, $500 increment, automatically adjusted according to what Cayugas does each year. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, anybody have any questions? Board members? Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, I have a question for our attorney. Without an end date and saying it's going for so many years, can we just have a rate that goes up every year without a hearing every year?
You can, yes, based on what what is being presented today, which is that that change will be based on the adjustment to Callegas's rate, as that occurs annually,
So we're depending on their having a hearing.
if they have one, or
Yeah.
if their rate
If
changes.
it, I mean, well,
With the idea being that that's the cost of replacement water, that we're setting up this disincentive for people to exceed their allocation. And so the presumption is that as that rate changes, the surcharge would change to create that disincentive.
Okay.
Your question, do they have a hearing on
Mike, you got,
well, my understanding was that we could
you got a
set a rate and say, if they're going to do it, we will increase ours for a certain number of years, but then at the end of those years, we'd have to come back and look at this again. I just didn't think it could be open-ended.
Dave?
And it can be open-ended?
Well, open-ended in the sense that there's no time limit on it, but it's always subject to your board's further action to adjust it one way or the other.
We can elect at any point in time to review it and rescind this and do it differently.
Right.
But absent us doing that, we're not obligated to have a specific public hearing each year to establish our surcharges. And in fact, the reality is that we've pegged surcharges for years when it was at the low number and never dealt with it for 2, 3, 4 years until we finally said we've got to do something, and then we dealt with it.
But we weren't changing it.
Yes.
I thought Prop 218 required us to have a hearing.
Well,
That was all I was saying.
oh, this is not subject to Prop 218.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so that answers that question. A point of clarification, and I'm not, and I may have not read it correctly. Tier 2 surcharges only applies for that water in excess of Tier 1, not retroactive to all water pumped. Is that correct? If somebody pumps at 250%, it's not back to the first acre foot over their allocation.
Currently, it would be.
Okay.
We could make that specification in the resolution if you
Okay,
prefer.
because as I read the resolution, it's not clear, and as I
Okay.
read it, I'm implying that it is in fact retroactive to the first acre foot. Once you go over the threshold, you're in Tier 2.
For the entire amount.
1 acre foot in Tier 2 puts everything in Tier 2.
Not being here for all the meetings, what is the allocation, what is the Tier 1 amount?
Well, we don't have, right now, we don't have any tiers. That's the proposal. But the surcharge
So
penalty.
how do we allocate that?
The surcharge penalty is $1,150 an acre foot if you pump over your allocation.
Okay, so, and what is that?
Your allocation depends on what your well history is.
Oh, okay.
Could be
So
10, 100, 1,000.
Okay.
So if a grower has, so if a grower has a 100 acre foot allocation and he pumps 101, he's in the surcharge box.
So it's an individual thing.
He can go and apply for irrigation efficiency and pull himself down and pay no penalty. He could cash in a credit and pay no cash, okay? He could, or he could pay the penalty.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right.
So now what we're having is, what the proposal is that range would go from
That allocation.
from 100 acre foot up to 199 acre feet. He's paying the full 1150. The minute he goes to 200 and above, for that 99, he's paying $1,600 an acre foot for all of that.
Okay.
And that's my
And
question.
we only have so many of those folks in that.
We got 5 in those. We got 5 in that
5 in
category.
that category.
We got 5 in that category based on the history of last year because this year's numbers haven't kicked in yet.
Right.
Okay. So that's one of my questions is, do we really want to do that and make the second tier retroactive into the first tier? So
Okay.
that's a question.
Okay.
And that's a board discussion, I think, and I'll hear that in a second. But sitting behind you, I see Bob would like to speak, so let me hear from Bob real quick, so.
Good afternoon, Robert Aranio from Crestview Mutual Water Company. A question that was not addressed in the staff report is how many acre feet of water? We have 5 customers that we're talking about that could be potentially involved in this, but what's the order of magnitude of how many acre feet they're actually pumping? And second of all, what would the surcharge money be? Would it be reserved in any way? Would it go into the general fund? Would it be set aside for projects, or is there going to be any restrictions on it? Third of all, my concern is if this is an attempt to deal with one particular pumper that exports water in little red balloons, the concern may be...
Little red water balloons.
Yes. If that is the case, then I would caution to providing potentially such a disincentive to cause that operation to maybe relocate and exacerbate our problem exponentially, because that source of revenue, which we desperately need in order to fund projects, is suddenly gone. Has there been any consideration to that point? At some point, a market force becomes so onerous that you actually harm yourself in trying to do good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, let's see if we can answer the first question.
I think so. If you don't have a photo, that I have a chart of the folks, and we anticipate that this might be one of the questions that came up. And specifically, of the 5 in the Tier 2, the red balloon operator is the, I'll give you names, of the 1,000, or the 750 of those acre feet are attributed to that particular operator. And then the remaining ones are relatively small. For a variety of reasons. Some of them is they may not even have an allocation, so they pump 10 and they had 0. Obviously, their percentage goes way up, and that puts them into Tier 2. But the volume of water that they're over-extracting is not large. So the remaining 3 or 4 operators are relatively small. The big one is that other particular operator.
Okay. The reality is, right now, we have operators that have been operating in a surcharge mode, and they have made the economic decision that they can operate in that surcharge mode as we continue to map out some management plans in the 2 most affected basins that we have in our area, the Pleasant Valley Oxnard Plain Basin and the Las Posas Basin. So with that in mind, from a market force standpoint, it is in fact working, except we have some oddball cases.
Yes.
And my question falls in the category of being so onerous in our penalty process to effectively make it retroactive to 0. I'm questioning if that's really what we want to do. Okay. If they're currently operating today in effectively Tier 1,
yes,
that's a big chunk of change, and it's a huge financial decision to do that. If anything, we want to prevent them from going into Tier 2, and one of the ways to prevent them going to Tier 2 is make that incremental water even more expensive rather than retroactive all the way back. Okay. That's kind of my thinking. I don't know what you guys want to do. But the way it's written here, it would imply to me that if you're in Tier 2, it's retroactive to everything, and that is a huge penalty. On 100 acre feet, at $500, that's what the upcharge would be, right? That's what, $50,000 just in that alone. That little move is another $50,000 hit just in that. Okay. Over what they're currently having to pay today.
Right.
Do we want to do that? That's my question, and I don't have the answer. What, Dave?
Well, I had a couple of questions entered my mind. One was the we seem to have kind of historically based things off of what Callegas does, and I think that's worked. I don't know if that's something we want to kind of do onwards in perpetuity. Who knows what ramifications might change Callegas' way of doing business, and maybe we don't always want to be in lockstep with that as a baseline. I don't know if that's right or not. The other thing I thought is that when you think about electrical rates or water rates, a lot of times your tiers are based on, just like you suggested, you meet that one tier, then you jump up to that next level. Now that portion that's in that next level is at that new rate. Maybe it's more consistent that we kind of follow that model that people are familiar with. I don't know. It seems more fair in my mind. I guess that's my opinion.
Okay.
Mike, any?
I woke up this morning thinking that we weren't being harsh enough, and now I hear us wanting to be a little softer than what we're proposing. So I'm hard-pressed to not agree with as it's presented.
Okay. I'm not sure that not wanting to be harsher is a fair statement, because there's a way you can accomplish, I think, an element of harshness, and that is you don't make the Tier 2 charges. The Tier 2 charges only applies to Tier 2 water, but does not apply to Tier 1 water. You could say that. But you change the rate of Tier 2 charges. Why does it have to be $500 an acre foot? Maybe it's $1,000. Maybe it is the full value to get it up to the $2,000 that, right? If the disincentive is to not keep going up,
Right.
I mean, if $1,000 is not a disincentive to pump beyond your allocation, I think we'd have a herd of people in that category, and we don't have that.
Right.
So I have to believe that the disincentive tied to Kiegas's basic number, and I hear your message about, do we really want to be tied to Kiegas forever? And I think that's a valid question, and we could put a stipulation that at least every 2 years we look at the structure. I mean, we always reserve the right to look at it. So I think we can administratively solve that problem, so we're constantly looking at it. If the intent of the surcharge has always been as a disincentive for over-pumping groundwater, and we've moved it from the $250, I think it was 20-some years ago when we started this little exercise, or when we passed Ordinance 5, the original one, and we've now ramped it up to $11.50, I think it's done pretty much what it's supposed to do, except for some oddball cases. My fear is letting it go beyond that, and so I would propose, Mike, a solution is you apply Tier 2 charges to Tier 2 water, but you change the rate, and you really ramp it up in that category. And maybe that's how you get an issue of not being aggressive enough without being so punitive in the process that 1 acre foot, I mean, 1 acre foot beyond, the 200% acre foot, the penalty that goes backwards is tremendous. So I don't know. That's
Sure. No,
I agree with you. And I want to tell you my experience. I've never heard of a tiered system that, I think it's more like a penalty system. A tiered system is where the increments are charged more. I mean, that's pretty much accepted as a tiered system. I think that what staff has proposed is more of a penalty system, and the tiered system would be confusing if we continued to call it that. I agree with you, Lynn, that the Tier 2 charges should only apply to water in Tier 2, and if we, say, doubled it or something like that. Back when Camarillo first adopted its tiered system, we didn't know we were going to have that drought in the early 90s. But about 2 months after we adopted it, at that time, we also went from billing every other month to billing monthly, and people thought their water bills would go down. Well, because of the tiers, their water bills didn't go down. And then we had to change again because there was quite a drought, and our tiers doubled. So we had 4 tiers. So you paid a basic $10 or something for anything in Tier 1, 20 in Tier 2, 40 in Tier 4, and 3, and $80 a unit, which is 735 acres for Tier 4. And we got a lot of people out of Tier 4, a lot of people out of Tier 3. It works. So you can charge as much as you want, just justify what it is. We have aquifers in overdraft conditions, and we can justify that. If you're pumping what you're supposed to be, which is your allocation or your efficiency, you can justify the right rate, and if you're going over that, you can justify really charging more.
Okay. Gerhard, I saw John.
Sure.
John, do you want to say something?
Oh, sorry.
Good afternoon, John Matthews. I'm speaking on behalf today just on my own, not for Pleasant Valley. As I was sitting here listening to this,
I'm sorry, I missed that.
you're not going to make me sit down and
No.
usually sit next to me and say,
Are you wearing the Pleasant Valley hat?
no, I'm wearing the John Matthews hat today.
Because that you see, I see Rob in the back nodding his head. Okay,
Yeah, okay.
That gives him incentives to say something. So.
Okay. I've heard the discussion here today, and I agree with most of the discussion on the tiered rate. I mean, I think it would be really unfair to have a situation where somehow, I don't know if I'd use the word retroactive, but have it go back to the first acre foot that exceeded their historical allocation. I mean, the anomaly that would happen there would be someone who has 100 acre feet historical allocation, pumps 199, pays the surcharge, and you have somebody do 201, and he pays the tier 2 on 101 acre feet. That seems a little disturbing to me. And I feel like, every month I'm coming here and saying the same thing, and I don't want to get a reputation as somebody who just doesn't want to move forward on things, but it concerns me that you've asked a question and Gerhard was able to respond on what have you got here? What is the numbers you're dealing with? There's always the elephant in the room that we're always talking about. It seems like that elephant is driving a lot of the things we do here. We've got one big user apparently that's way over, and it's a significant amount of water. Unfortunately, I see a lot of things come across my desk with people with water problems, and sometimes I can help them, and sometimes I can't. Oftentimes, it may be an older couple that don't have access to other water, and let's say they have no historical allocation. They may be only pumping 10 acre feet a year for their domestic use, and all of a sudden you're going to drop the atomic bomb on them and say it's $5,000 an acre foot if you're in tier 2. They're in tier 2 to the first glass of water they drink, because they're at 0. And so if you make such a huge number, you may have situations that you just, again, we've always got this one individual. I don't mean to pick on him, but it seems like it drives a lot of our thinking. It's driven a lot of the credits issues, and sometimes I think we just need to take a deep breath, go back and see really what the problem is. As Gerhard said, you've got 4 people or 5 people. 4 of them are really, in my mind, from what I heard, really non-issues. They're not very much water. And to think that we're going to solve all our water problems by giving gigantic surcharges on these people, I don't know if that's really going to solve your water problems. So those are my comments. Thanks for listening.
Okay. John, hold on a second.
Sure. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think the whole idea that we're trying to do here is to stop the overuse of water by some kind of penalty. And the question is, do we go back to acre foot 1, or maybe any acre foot above the 200% should be maybe more like $2,000 or $3,000 as opposed to $1,600 or to penalize, as opposed to going to retroactively back to the 100 foot acre foot like you mentioned. So I'm not sure. Maybe that might be the
Well, I think the issue that John raised is that because it's a percentage-based mathematical formula, you could actually get somebody triggering it at a relatively small usage of water and then wind up with this. So setting at $3,000 an acre foot is, in my opinion, or some astronomical number, could be so non-functional that it forces people into a litigation mode because it's non-functional, and or it penalizes a very small individual by the sheer mechanics of being caught up in an administrative process. So I'm not sure what the answer is. I guess what I'm leaning towards, my comment then would be that maybe the answer is that we really don't pass this today, but we give some direction to staff to do some reworking on this logic and bring it back to the December meeting. Because I think, and Reddy has something he wants to say. Reddy, before you speak, Mike, let me hear from Mike, and then I'll hear from you, please.
Gerhard, I was wondering, of the 750 acre feet we addressed a few seconds ago.
Yeah.
Are those acre feet above the 200% level, or were those acre feet above the 100% level?
That is, they have, just to throw the numbers, they have about 255 acre historical allocation, and they're using 1,023.
So that would be from
So there's the
overage one.
subtraction, and then you can do,
And so then everything above about 510 feet would be in the 200 group. So you're roughly looking at 200 feet that would get the big, if we use your plan.
the proportional.
The problem I see then with going to $1,000 for that way overage, that's $250,000. If you do it from acre foot one, it's 375. So it does cut the thing down a bit, but might be a more rational disincentive.
Okay, ready.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Reddy Bakala with Water and Sanitation Department of the Public Works Agency. As you know, we are in the municipal industrial business. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 is exactly how you're debating is we only charge Tier 2 for any water that exceeds Tier 1. We think that's the fairest way to do Tier 2, Tier 3s if you want to do Tier 2, Tier 3s. Some of my concerns about this Tier 2 is we may have problems with the small mutual water companies, especially during a drought time. If, for example, if they were to exceed their allocations, they may be paying lots of penalties. So if your intent is to take care of very large water users, maybe there should be a limit, like in Las Posas Basin, you talked about 4 acre foot per acre, for example. Maybe there should be a volume. If you go beyond certain volume, there should be a Tier 2 should kicking in, so that way those people are paying larger amounts because they're exceeding certain volume of water. So this may be something that you may want to consider. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Reddy. Anybody else have any comments on this? I've made a suggestion that, well, in my own personal little world of thought here, I'm not prepared to vote on this because I think there are some things that we need to kind of think through, some language that I want some clarification on. One, are we going to go to a retroactive tier process or a stepping stone tier process? Those are my words. I'm not sure if that's how, but Reddy described it. I think we all described it. You pay Tier 1 charges on the water that's used in Tier 1. You pay Tier 2 charges for all water that goes into Tier 3. It may be that the answer is we come up with more tiers. It may be that you come up with a Tier 1, 100 to 150, and you start ratcheting it up in some other method. I don't know. So, and also I do believe that we have to address, I think, the what if we get an oddball case that John described. And I am appreciative, John, of your comments, because you have made it in the past that we can get ourselves focused on this one entity, but my comment to that is that they have triggered things that I don't think we actually have thought about, because we, as I've said from day one, this ordinance we created ourselves. We didn't go to the shelf and pull it off the shelf. This is a learning process for us, and the penalty surcharge process has worked primarily because it was a disincentive, and I don't think it's right to necessarily break somebody's back in the process. And I think making it retroactive all the way to zero to the beginning is breaking somebody's back. I think that's wrong. Okay. And I think we need to come up with a stepped process. I would suggest staff do a cut at that. I would suggest that we have some methodology built in place to try to tackle some of the possibilities that John has raised. I don't know how we get around that, but we need to look at that so we don't get mom and pop in here. Right? We have an unintended consequence. And I'm not opposed to more than 2 tiers if that's a solution. And I'm not opposed to eliminating the whole process, but changing the fixed dollar amount for everybody. I think it's a work in progress, so I'd like it to come back in December, and let's take another look at it. That's where I'm thinking. What do you want to do, Mike?
I actually, just on the numbers that I've just worked out, I think your original suggestion was much closer to reality than I had thought. If you applied $1,000 to everything that was in excess of the 200%, a small pumper who barely went past it, that would be a minimal amount of money applied to just the little bit they went past. And the $1,000 a foot would be enough to keep people trying to save. So you were more correct, I think, than you realized on your first suggestion of the $1,105 for the first tier and the $1,600 replaced by $1,000 a foot for everything in excess of 200%.
Okay. Dave?
I'm okay with waiting if you'd like to wait.
Okay. You okay? Obviously, we didn't have to send it back. What do you guys want to do? Wait? Okay.
I'm okay, and I think Reddy mentioned something important, that we need to look at that, because we're going to penalize the small mutuals, that probably can't afford to go beyond that, the allocation. I think we ought to look at it.
Okay. The last item is, and it falls in the category of, hey, hello, credits, ha ha ha. It's theoretically possible that a pumper could be at the 205%, and we go with this new number. Does every acre foot that he has in his credit bank have equal value to retire the acre foot that he takes, regardless of whatever the surcharge is? Yeah. Is the acre foot credit only worth $11.50? Therefore, anything above the $11.50 he has to redeem two? I don't think that's what our intent was. All right. So I think we need to be careful on that. If that is the case, if in fact you could get a pumper that is in excess of the 200 acre feet, and he's facing a huge financial, we have put a huge incentive on him to go find credits, because it may be cheaper to find credits someplace than to pay a cash bill, and which raises my concern that I've raised. I do not want credits to take on a whole world unto itself to solve problems of becoming a form of currency. So I think you could set the penalty so high that you will then force issues in another direction, and it's the credit issue, and we got to force ourselves through that. Now, that may not all come to pass. I've got to believe that there are some creative folks out there that will figure out how to swim upstream on that little sucker, and we will have to face that problem. So the recommendation is, direction to staff is, bring it back in the December meeting. Let's get another cut at this and go from there. Everybody okay with that? Okay? Everybody in the audience okay with that? All right, that's what we're going to do.
Thank you.
All right, let's go deal with item 7.
Mr. Chairman, I have to recuse myself.
Okay.
I as well.
Okay. Well, let's talk about this for a second. Sam, you're an alternate. Sam, do you have to recluse yourself on this issue?
No.
Al, in the middle of the meeting, is it okay to put an alternate in for just this one item? Are we legal to do that?
Yes, you are.
Sam, join us, please.
Not too sure I want to.
Well, Sam, I'm going to get Dan to sit for me so I can walk out too. See, it's your old chair back, right? We saved it just for you. All right, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, my name is Rick Virgoots, and I'll be presenting item number 7 today. Just as a matter of reference, we heard this item partially back in May when it was coupled with Zone's request to file for irrigation efficiency retroactively. And in May, the decision was made to wait on the item in front of you today until we squared away the issue with Zone's retroactive irrigation efficiency, and that's since been done. So today we're here to discuss the issue of the request for the transfer of credits. I have 6 slides, and I'll just go through them briefly. Zone operates wells within the GMA, and some of Zone's customers have their own wells. And in this case, the well that we're talking about is known as the well for John Borchard Enterprises. And in the past, Zone has used credits to offset surcharges that it has incurred. Today, though, moving forward since 2007, Zone's been filing for irrigation efficiency. I mentioned this a moment ago. Zone was recently authorized to retroactively file for irrigation efficiency, and that was approved. That issue is still an issue we're going to have to deal with. During the review, we found water purveyors filing for irrigation efficiency sometimes find it difficult to provide the same level of detail required by individual operators. And so this is something the agency is going to need to work on in the future. A little more in the background. So these are some specifics. During 1998 to 2006, Zone delivered 1,119 acre-feet of water to John Borchard entities. During that same time period, the Borchard well developed 774 credits. And during 1998 to 2006, Zone used some of its credits to offset surcharges. Zone requests that the credits earned on Mr. Borchard's well during the time frame that Zone delivered water to it be transferred to Zone. And Zone indicates the credits are needed so it can provide those to Callegas Municipal Water District for water required for blending. This is so Zone can deliver water that has is suitable for irrigation. It purchases about 500 acre-feet of water from Callegas a year for this. In line with the ordinance, Mr. Borchard and Zone have provided a jointly signed request to this effect that the credits be transferred. The agency ordinance requires that credit transfers be authorized by your board. And if authorized, Zone would gain 767.162 credits from the John Borchard entity's well, and staff recommends your board authorize this credit transfer in the amount of 767.162 credits. And that concludes my presentation.
Okay. Just as a kind of a background for members of the board, this issue has been in front of the GMA staff for a long period of time. Zone folks have met with staff, have gone through this. We've sent it back and forth to get clarification. When you boil the process down, it's within the ordinance. It's a case where somebody's been supplying water and somebody's been earning credits. Those credits really need to be the person that supplied the water. So it's as much of an administrative process as anything. There are some questions that staff has raised with regards of record keeping, and they're going to work through those issues, but it shouldn't hold up the process of transferring the credits. And so my recommendation would be staff's recommendation, and that is we approve this transfer of credits, given the staff work, their review of the process. It's well within the ordinance, and it's logical, and it's fair.
Move the approval.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Anybody in the audience having a discussion on this? Ready.
Reddy Patel again, representing Ventura County Water Works District number 119. As you know, this is much larger than just a credit issue. We have been working on the SALS TMDL, and Callegas has been providing this water to provide a higher quality for ag purposes. And we fully support your staff's recommendation that the credits will be transferred to Callegas.
Thank you, Reddy. Okay. Carol, did you want to speak?
Hi, Carol Schoen, Zone Mutual Water Company, Chair Mulhart, Board. Thank you very much for taking this issue on today. And yes, we've been working at this for a while, and we're anxious to get it behind us. We have transferred credits to Callegas already for about 2.5 years worth of water that we've purchased for blending, and this amount of credits will give us the ability to buy about 1.5 years more worth of water, and we're trying to just be able to meet the interim need of blending this water. Part of the need for this is that there is interim permit with the TMDLs that zone has water for blending, and part of our negotiations in doing that is to provide these credits. So we don't want them to run out. We don't want zone to run out of credits before the brine line's in place and there's other water for blending. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Henry?
Henry Gromlich, Cayugas Municipal Water District. I'd like to echo what Ray Bacala mentioned and what Carol has also addressed, in that this is really an essential part of how we're dealing with salts in the Las Posas Basin. Of interest to your board is it's taking credits that would otherwise be redeemed in the confined aquifer with limited good quality water, and it facilitates the use of much poorer quality water, essentially expanding the water supply available to the pumpers in zone. At the same time as it moves those credits into a controlled program, which is something that your board has supported and discussed in the latest credit workshop. So Cayugas supports the staff recommendation. Urge you to make the transfer.
Okay, thank you, sir. All right, any other questions? Let's have a roll call, please.
Chair Mulhart?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Zaragoza?
Yes.
Director McIntyre?
Yes. Okay, very good. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Sam. All right, number 8.
Again, for the record, Brian Bondi with United Water and the GMA. I'm presenting item 8. Item 8 is proposed resolution 2010-08. Really, the request before you is to repeal resolution 2010-01 and replace it with proposed resolution 2010-08. As you may recall, resolution 2010-01 approved a program involving the use of United's Good Deed Credit Trust and certain allocations, certain historical allocations previously held by Vulcan Materials Company to facilitate United's purchase of the Farrell property for future recharge operations. Part of that program included the eventual retirement of most of the historical allocations that were acquired from Vulcan, all but 107 acre-feet of historical allocation, and thereby providing a long-term benefit to the groundwater basin. The amount of allocation that was to be retained was for on-site uses by United in perpetuity, dust control and other types of activities that go on these large properties require water. And the amount that was to be retained was based on an assumption that a pre-existing agricultural lease in the frontage area of the Farrell property would be terminated in calendar year 2010. Subsequent to acquisition of the properties and adoption of resolution 2010-01, United has looked at the leaseholders' agricultural practices and determined they will not impact potential future recharge operations or groundwater. And the board has authorized United staff to negotiate a 10-year lease with the agricultural leaseholder. That's the intent anyway. So essentially, the request before you really comes down to a request to increase the amount of the allocation that was to be retained in perpetuity up from 107 acre-feet per year to 211. Again, these numbers are historical allocation. And that would be to accommodate the agricultural leaseholders' water needs. Essentially, what you would be doing is reducing the amount of allocation that was to be retired in 2019 for the program from 1,437 acre-feet to 1,333. So that's an overview of what's being asked. I have a few slides that provides a little more context for the request. This map shows 3 properties. Before United acquired the Farrell property and Rose property, Vulcan held their plant site, Farrell property, and Rose property. This is LA Avenue, Santa Clara River, Vineyard. In total, Vulcan held 1,677 acre-feet of historical allocation for the wells on these 3 properties. After today's reduction of 25%, that is equivalent to 1,258 acre-feet in today's terms.
When United acquired the property, they acquired the historical allocations associated with the wells on the Farrell property and through a separate transaction, the Rose property. And Vulcan at the time retained 1,000 acre feet of historical allocation. Upon adopting Resolution 2010-01, your board authorized the transfer of 867 acre feet from the plant site to United's new operator account for the Farrow and Rose properties. So in total, United ended up with 1,544 acre feet of historical allocation. After you apply the 25% reduction that's now in effect, in today's terms, that's 1,158 acre feet of potential water use. In terms of what was approved by your board in Resolution 2010-01, there was, again, this water use to be retained in perpetuity, the 80 acre feet of allocation, using today's numbers for on-site uses, site maintenance, dust control, so on and so forth. And in the staff report, we talked about 120 acre feet for year 2010 to accommodate the existing lease. And part of that existing lease allowed water use on an off-site property from one of the wells on site. So that's where the 120 comes from. And of course, in the first year of the program, Oxnard's use of the water for the larger program doesn't come into play. Moving ahead to year 2011, the plan was that the lease would go away. There would be no water allocation needed to serve the agricultural needs, and Oxnard is still not yet taking their portion of the water for the program. Years 2012 through 2019, again, just on-site uses, Oxnard's 1,000 acre feet per year under the program, and then the eventual retirement of all but 80 acre feet. That was what was approved in the, well, that's what the idea was. One of the things we want to correct today that is a little bit separate from United's request is the 120 acre feet for 2010. That was clearly written in the staff report. Unfortunately, it was omitted in the resolution. It's one thing we want to add in today. So that's the first change that we're talking about today. The second change is the proposed addition of 78 acre feet per year in today's numbers at post 25% reduction in perpetuity to accommodate the proposed ag lease extension on the frontage area of the Farrell property. So this updated table here shows how the allocation comes about. And so for year 2010, current year, 200 acre feet of the former Vulcan allocations for on-site plus the previous ag lease. 2011, 80 plus 78, 158 usage. Oxnard's usage kicks in for 8 years. And then at 2020, all but 158 acre feet would be retired, again using post-reduction numbers. So the request before you basically rolls down to fixing the 120 that we omitted, adding 78 acre feet per year for the lease area, and so the summary slide covers that. One side issue in looking at agricultural uses on the property, GMA staff expressing concern that perhaps those operations might impact future use of the pit portion of the Farrell property for recharge operations. United has been conducting some water quality testing and is looking into that issue. So we negotiated to add some language into the resolution that speaks to controlling runoff into the pits and monitoring the agricultural water quality that's going into the ground there for the purposes of protecting groundwater in the pits. And so there's language in there to that effect. But in essence, I've already described the two main changes, and our recommendation is to adopt Resolution 2010-08.
Okay, thank you. Any members have any questions of what's being proposed? Mike?
Yeah, on the cover letter from United, on the third paragraph, the 80 feet is to be used for the Farrell, Rose, and Noble properties. And then back in the discussion of 2010-01, it's recommended the same 80 acre feet. My question is, I didn't see the Noble property designated on your graphic? Is it adjacent?
I would have
part
to
of the
defer
road?
to,
No, it's across the road. Go back to your original slide.
that property is in the proximity.
The Noble Pit is right next to the
it's
road.
this one here.
We've already owned it. And the reason it's not highlighted in blue, in this purchase, we didn't buy that. We had already owned it.
Right, well, but it was mentioned in the cover as that 80 acre feet was to be used to help maintain that.
So we're going to use the 80 acre feet on all our pits out there, or, I think it's collective, right, isn't it?
I'm not familiar. Where do we get our water for Noble Pit?
Currently, the 80 feet was to be used. I'm not arguing with the thing, I was just wanting to know where it had fit in.
Mike Solomon, United Water. Currently, we're using Vulcan's well, and we're trying to get off their well and use our own water.
But it's contiguous property, so
Yes,
that's...
yes.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
What happened with the ag lease? You thought it was not going to be continued on, and then did it go on longer than you guys had anticipated, or?
No, I'll answer that. Yeah, because I was concerned, and we talked with staff. This wasn't a bait and switch with the GMA. We didn't intend it. The intent was to take ag off the property, but as our board looked at it and said, that piece of property is going to be used for recharge. It's not set up. And so it's providing a real nice sort of protection buffer against people getting on the property and stuff. Somebody's watching it. So our board said, why don't we look at a way to help the farmer keep farming there, as long as it doesn't affect our ability to recharge or affect the quality of the water we're recharging. So it was just an opportunity to let the farmer keep in business, because that piece of property up in the corner, he's still going to be farming anyway. That part right there, yeah.
Oh,
that's
okay.
his property.
It actually went around in a lot of discussion at the board. I think the original intent of the board was to remove the farming operation completely. And then, as we started looking at it more in detail, we had this long strip along Vineyard Avenue. What do we do with it? Well, we'd have a weed problem. We'd have to maintain it. It's a dust problem. It's every problem in the world with a big, dry piece of ground. And so we tasked staff to look at the farming practices. We've signed a lease with the operator in significant farming practices, making sure we don't get the runoff and all the things. And we think from a logistics standpoint and a management standpoint, with the contract that we've signed with the operator, it's better to have it actually operated for dust and maintenance and everything than to let it be just weeds that we'd have to maintain. So that was the logic. Okay. All right. So the motion that we need is to rescind resolution.
That's incorporated in the
Okay,
resolution.
so the only motion then is to adopt ordinance, resolution number 2010-08. That's what the recommendation is?
Yes.
Can I have a motion?
Move the approval.
I second that.
Okay, a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Any comments from the audience? Okay, a roll call, please.
Chair Mulhart?
Yes?
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Zaragoza? Director Kelly?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Okay, let's go back to item 4, and I know I have some directors that have appointments at whenever you go, so we'll go into item number 4. Brian will cover it, and if somebody feels like they need to go at the time they have to go, then, okay. But let's go ahead.
How long do?
What's that? Okay. All right. Brian.
Okay. While we're waiting for the slides, item 4, we're calling a groundwater model update, and what we hope to accomplish today is to update your board on the status of the Ventura Regional Groundwater Model. This model is an important tool that the GMA relies upon and others for water resource planning and groundwater management. We don't talk about it a lot, but it is an integral part of the agency's groundwater management plan, and it's something that we rely on for future planning. Recently, United's groundwater department staff and myself completed a review of the model, and what we're trying to do is basically answer 2 questions. How well does the model reproduce real-world conditions, and is the model capable of answering the more complicated questions that we're starting to be faced with today and in the future? This is an important thing to do because, as we all know, the cost of water is going up and the cost of projects to bring more water are going up just as well. And so the ability to accurately predict things into the future has real value. And for decision makers, obviously having a tool that's able to help you understand what future conditions might be like is certainly valuable. I've broken this presentation into 3 general sections. The first section is just a quick background on the model for your benefit and for benefit of the folks in the audience. The second will give you details of the results of the model review that was completed by United. And then the last thing that I'm going to go over are implications for the agency. And there's 2 items in that third section that I'm requesting board member feedback on. One's related to scheduling and one's related to financial aspects. So what is the Ventura Regional Groundwater Model? What do we use it for? And why is it important to the agency? Well, models in general are basically just representations of the real world. When I think of a model, I picture a scaled airplane in a wind tunnel with engineers trying to figure out how the aerodynamics work and how to better design the plane. Well, with groundwater, we can't build physical models like that. We use math. So groundwater models are mathematical models of the aquifer or series of aquifers in the groundwater basins. Basically, we couple our knowledge of the geology with equations and calculate groundwater flow and elevations. And the Ventura Regional Model is just that. It's a model of the upper Santa Clara River basins, Piru, Fillmore, Santa Paula, the plain basins, Oxnard Plain, Pleasant Valley, Las Posas, and Santa Rosa Valley is the geographic coverage. The regional model was originally built by the United States Geological Survey during the late 80s and 90s, completed in 96. It was designed to be just that, a regional model. And regional models, by definition, tend to be low detail, broad brush. They focus on macro trends in groundwater, regional changes, not area-specific or project-specific local questions, are not typically within the realm of what those models are designed for, and that's the case with our model. What is the model used for, and why is it important to the agency? Well, it's essentially, again, it's our primary planning tool. If you need to look no further than our GMP to see how we've used the model to predict things like the basin yield and how different management strategies will affect groundwater levels and quantity in the future. So it's an integral tool to any update to our GMP, and it's integral to our planning. So moving on to the summary of the model review. As I mentioned, there were 2 basic questions. How well is the model representing real-world conditions in the aquifers, and is it capable of answering the more difficult questions that we're starting to be faced with? It's helpful to understand the overall model development process before we go into the results of the review. This flow chart kind of runs you through it. Basically, you define your questions. What do we need to understand? What are we trying to model? You develop your conceptual model of the basins. This incorporates the geology, where are the aquifers, how thick they are, what are their properties. That sort of information is compiled at that step. All of this stuff down here pertains to developing the math part of it. Typically, we don't have to really do any of that. There's a lot of peer-reviewed codes that are out there that are used. We use USGS ModFlow, so none of this really applies. Once you have a conceptual model and you've chosen a program to deal with the math, you design the model, and that incorporates things like building a grid for the calculations and so on and so forth. Basically, you're translating your conceptual model into the numerical piece. Then really what we're going to focus on today is the calibration phase. And this is the part, this flow chart doesn't really do it justice. This is really the key to modeling. This is where you take your initial estimates of aquifer properties, water levels, and so on and so forth, and you try and make the model reproduce reality. This is a very iterative process. You make a guess, you get an output, you find out you're wrong, you go through this process until you are calibrated. Okay. Some folks also do what's called a verification, where after you've determined that you're calibrated, you look at a different period of time and see how well the model represents that other period, presumably when stresses are different. Maybe it's a drought versus a wet time, something like that. And when you're all done with that and you've decided the model is adequately calibrated, you use it for prediction and you present your results. And that's where the GMP groundwater management plan comes in. It's also been used for EIRs and other studies. And then the last step, and you'll see this is a loop back to the beginning, is what's called a post-audit. And this is where you take a model that's been developed, and typically you'll look at a period post-model development and say, how well did the model match conditions after we built it? In other words, you're saying, how well did it reproduce another period that we didn't design it for? To my knowledge, that hasn't been done on the model, and this would have been one approach to doing our model review, would have been to say, look, we've looked at the model through 1998, let's see how it matches the next decade. We chose not to do that because we already had some hunches that some things didn't quite make sense. We also know that the calibration from the original USGS work was not documented as well as we'd like. We still had questions. And also over the 15 years since the model was finished, United has completed other updates to the model. There's been a lot of work done. So there was good reason to just go right back to here and look at the calibration. And that's exactly what we did. So when you talk about calibration, you have to talk about model error. And all model error really means is how different is the model than your measured field conditions. And that's a real simple calculation. If you have a water level measurement from a well and you have a calculated water level from your model, what's the difference? And graphically, that's what this looks like. This graph is showing the solid line is output from the model for a lower system well. The black dashed line with the dots is data from that location from an actual well, your field data plotted at the divisions here are 25 feet over the calibration period, 1986 to 2000. And you can see that in this example, we have a very good fit. The model is tracking along with the measured data. And this is an example of a good fit. Now, in terms of the error, we look at something called mean absolute error. And all that really means is each place where you have a measurement and a model output, you're taking the absolute value of the difference between those two and looking at the average. The reason we use the absolute value is because when the model's low, model's high, you could have those offset. You could actually have a condition where you'd calculate a zero error but be this far off in one area and this far off in another, and they just cancel each other out. So we have to normalize things. Another way of looking at this error, instead of thinking in terms of feet or units of length, is just levels of calibration. And what we typically look at here is what are the uncontrollable errors? Survey error. When you take a measurement, it's an estimate. It's within a foot or two. The elevation of the point that you're referencing when you take a measurement on a well may have some error. And when you look at the model output, there's error because the model calculates values at points. It's not continuous across space. So your point may be here, but the well you're comparing to may be here. There's error in interpolating in between where you're measuring and where you're comparing it to. Turns out if you add up those errors, our best estimate is that plus or minus 5 feet is sort of the buffer. Anywhere within plus or minus 5 feet is considered a match, perfect match, because you don't really know how much error is in your measurements. That's a level 1, the green. Going out to level 2 and 3, you're just adding 5 feet on it. So I do this with the colors just to make it intuitive when we look at some of our maps. It's easier just to see. So what did we do? Well, if you look back at the way the model had been put together, there were approximately 60 locations. Let me back up. Our review was limited to just a portion of the model domain: Piru, Fillmore, Santa Paula, Forebay, Oxnard Plain, and Pleasant Valley. We did not look at the Las Posas Valley and Santa Rosa, primarily because those portions of the regional model are outside of United's district. Within these areas, there's approximately 60 locations where calibration was reviewed in the past, and that's the dots on the map. Blue dots represent upper aquifer system wells. Red dots represent lower aquifer system wells. And the size of those dots gives you some feeling of what the air is at those locations. They're scaled out here, going from our level 1 and 2s, which are the dots that you can probably barely see. Some of you may not be able to see them at all, going all the way up to level 9 or 10, where the model is 40 to 50 feet different than the measurements. Okay. Overall, this actually doesn't look too bad, with the exception of Pleasant Valley. We have a lot of small dots on the plain, forebay, and a mixed bag in the upper river basins. The table up here gives you a summary of the ranges for each basin, and really, with the exception of PV having an outlier out there of 45 feet and an average of 22, things actually don't look too bad. But because we had concerns about what was going on in the forebay with the model, I won't go into what those concerns were. We don't have time. What we decided to do was, let's look at other locations. What's the air out here where we have no calibration points? What's the air in the rest of the forebay where we don't have calibration points? You know, you can see that there's only 4 in the forebay, for example. So I got ahead of myself. Sorry. These graphs just show a couple of locations where we had really good fits, and these graphs show a couple of the locations where the fit wasn't so good. And I'll point out that this one in particular, an upper system well near the coast, model is over-predicting heads across the board. Not what you want your model to be doing in an area where you have concerns about seawater intrusion. So what we did with our review is we pulled United's groundwater database, and we found all the wells that had more than 30 records during the calibration period of 86 to 2000. And we input those into the model just like the existing 60 that you saw on the slide, and we did the same analysis. We also added some locations in the shallow alluvium layer here in the upper river basins. This layer was added to the model after the USGS handed it over. So these graphs tell us what we're seeing when we add in those extra calibration points. And it doesn't probably mean anything to you, but let me explain it. What you're looking at are 4 different graphs for 4 different basins: Santa Paula, Forebay, Oxnard Plain, and Pleasant Valley. On the y-axis, you're looking at model output, and it's plotted against field measurement. So this is model water levels versus measured water levels from actual wells. In a perfect world, a perfect model, which you'll never see, all that data would fall on those black 45-degree angle lines. Model would exactly match measured. What you see is that we don't have that. Let me add a couple bars here. These 2 bars that are straddling the perfect fit line represent plus or minus 10 feet on either side of the perfect fit line. So we're talking about the level 2. Anything outside of the bandwidth is level 3 or higher calibration. So more than 10 feet different than field conditions. And so basically everything outside of that bandwidth is of concern. The further away from the bandwidth, obviously the more concern. When you look at these, the way to read them is that the higher numbers are going to be the upper portions of your basin. This isn't working. Here we go. So this would be the up gradient or eastern end of Santa Paula Basin. And you see here that we have a bias in the blue representing upper system wells. We have a bias to over-predict heads. So that means that water levels in the model world are higher than in the field. And this is our recharge area. So what that suggests is perhaps there's an issue in the model with the recharge. In the Forebay Basin, we see that pretty much across the board, the modeled water levels are greatly above the measurements. This points to a pretty foundational problem with how the recharge is being implemented in the model in the Forebay Basin. And this is pretty fundamental because, as we all know, the Forebay Basin receives the recharge, which then charges the Oxnard Plain. So if you have problems in the Forebay, that's going to propagate out into the rest of the model domain, down gradient, downstream of that area. Oxnard Plain looks pretty good, with the exception of a group of wells that are probably misclassified in the model as they're incorporated as upper system wells. Those wells are probably misclassified and are really lower system wells. So this is more of a conceptual model issue. Do we understand which aquifer the wells are screened in? What do those water levels represent? Well, that translates into the model. You need to know what it represents if you're calibrating it against it, because you're making your model fit your data, and if you're telling the model it's in one system but it's really in the other, you get obvious issues there. Oops. Oxnard, Pleasant Valley, again, is a lot of scatter here. We have a lot of really the opposite problem with probably some wells being misclassified in the opposite sense here. And we just have a lot of data that's really far off in both directions. These upper system wells in blue, some of them are probably misclassified as well. So this points to a couple of things: conceptual model issues, classifying our wells, what aquifer they're in, and recharge issues. Another point to make here is some of what I'm calling misclassification is also an artifact of how the model was constructed. We have two layers throughout most of the model domain. The upper layer is representing the upper system, but there's multiple aquifers in the upper system, the Oxnard and the Magoo. Same thing in the lower system. We have one layer representing Hueneme. Some people break out the Hueneme into upper and lower. Fox Canyon and Grimes. So as many as 4 aquifers being represented by a single model layer. Obviously, you have head differences in those aquifers, but the model is just averaging all that. So a lot of the scatter has to do with the limitation of the number of layers. What does the air look like in distribution geographically? Again, with the more comprehensive 300 data point set. These colors correspond back to the calibration levels that I started with. So basically anything orange and red is sort of out of the envelope of what we'd like to see. Now you see a lot of yellow and green out here on the Oxnard Plain. We have to call that into question because we know again that the recharge and the air in the forebay is rather large. So that effect basically is saying these areas are probably right for the wrong reason. When we look up in Piru, depends on your perspective. Here's a situation in Piru where most of the basin looks really good, but the recharge area of the basin and the discharge area of the basin are really out of whack in model world. And these hydrographs show what that looks like at those locations. The model is greatly under-predicting heads in both locations, and it's just not really representing both the seasonal trends very well or the long-term climatic trends. Just look how big the drought was in the model compared to what we actually saw in the field. So the hydrologic processes in this particular area would need to be looked at. Here's a location in the forebay, an upper system well. This is away from the area where the calibration targets were used by USGS, and what we see is same kind of thing. The seasonal trends are very amplified compared to what we see in the real world data, and we have large periods of time where the model's telling us that we have a lake. That's these water levels above this dashed line or above land surface. So obviously we've discovered some things that need to be looked at. Getting back to having the single layer representing multiple aquifers, here's a location in Pleasant Valley where we have a nested well put in by the USGS. We have 2 screen intervals in the upper system in 2 different water-bearing units. We see that there's this is 25 foot every line here, so the difference between those 2 different screen intervals is on the order of 30, 40 feet. So the best you could expect a single, well, here's what the model gives you. It kind of matches the upper system, or the upper screen interval. Missed the drought here. But the point I'm trying to make is the best you could hope for is the model to give you a reproduction of some sort of average of the different conditions within that layer, and we're not even really there. So this is speaking more to the limitation of a single layer. One of the things we look at United is available storage in the forebay, and this reads just like a hydrograph. The black lines are your measure data, basically telling you how much available space is there to be filled up by water. 80,000 is kind of a key level that we look at for reasons I won't go into. But the point here is what would the model tell us over the same period of time? Again, overestimating on the order of 20 to 40,000 acre-feet of available storage, depending on where you're at. And if you were using this as a planning tool, predicting in the future, what this would give us is more confidence in how much water we have available, really, and that's not where we want to be. Looking at the layer that represents the upper aquifer system, this graphic basically just shows you areas where the model is saying we have unconfined conditions versus confined conditions, and I won't go into what that means. I'll just tell you that all of the area in the upper river basins should be unconfined. This should all be red. We shouldn't have, basically anywhere we see blue, the model's saying we have water above land. In the forebay by definition is unconfined. It should all be red. And you see that here along the river and near some of United's facilities where we recharge water, the model's saying it's confined. Again, water levels are too high. And Pleasant Valley should be all confined. It should be all blue. So that just graphically gives you kind of a sense of where we're off. Moving to the lower system real quickly. A lot of air in Pleasant Valley, a lot of air, basically the forebay, most of the plain, and I think I've got an example here. Yes, another nested well location. The upper nest is probably in the Hueneme. The lower nests are probably in the Fox. That's not what's important. What's important is that we, again, have multiple aquifers with different water levels. We have a single layer trying to represent all this. The model does a really good job of matching the upper heads, and that was by design. That was a decision by USGS to calibrate to Hueneme. Yet we know that we have water level conditions in the Fox that are much lower. So again, the best we could hope for with a single layer is some sort of average. So just real quick in summary, what did we find? We found that the conceptual model that forms the basis of our numerical model is the major issue. We've got a single layer representing multiple aquifers. There are just inherent limitations in that no matter how well the calibration is, those will prevent us from looking at certain things like aquifer-specific questions. What's going to happen in the Fox if we do this in the Hueneme or vice versa? Can't do it. Just not with the single layer construction. We have questions about geologic flow barriers. United's working on a project evaluating flow barriers out on the plain. Those will provide changes for the model. And we have questions about parameter distributions, hydraulic conductivity, storage values, so on and so forth. I won't bore you with those. In summary, we found large errors in areas where there were no calibration targets originally in the model. We found that those errors are biased spatially. Some areas are really high off in the positive direction, some are very far off in the negative direction, and they're clustered. That's systematic. We found in some areas that the hydrologic trends just aren't being represented correctly, and we have big concerns in the forebay with how the recharge is being handled. So where does this all leave us? What United staff have proposed to their board is to embark on a significant revision of the groundwater model. This is a 3+ year project. It'll involve United's groundwater department staff, myself. We're looking at approximately $500,000 over a period of time to cover new staff and outside expenses, and the use of 1.5 of the existing senior staff's full-time equivalent status. So this is a big, big project. What are the implications for the GMA? Past uses of the model. We've estimated the basin yield. We've all heard the 100,000 acre-feet per year number. Well, the question I keep getting is that a good number? How does this change this? Well, based on looking at other information, talking with Steve, we don't think that even though we have the issues with the model, we have other data that suggests that we're not that far off, probably plus or minus 10%. We think we're within the 10% envelope. Effectiveness of the management strategies that are talked about in the GMP. Excuse me. Is the absolute magnitude of how much water level impact of those strategies going to change? Sure. Will the ranking of those strategies change? Probably not. In other words, our conceptual understanding of how those will work and the order in which we've ranked them probably will not change much. The big issue probably is the reliance on the forebay. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of proposed strategies in the management plan that talk about transferring credits to the forebay and pumping them back in the forebay and finding ways to use the forebay more like a surface water reservoir. Well, there's limits on that. At some point, we can overpump the forebay. And because we have a lot of the issues in the model revolve around how recharge is being handled in the forebay, we're not so sure what those limits are in terms of the model predictions. We may have to find that out through some of the pumping programs that we've implemented with the City of Oxnard, and the Good Deed Credit Trust and other things will tell us a lot about that. But we can't answer that question right now. Now getting into the items that staff is looking for feedback from the board. The first one is the groundwater management plan update. The management plan recommends that it's updated every 5 years. That would put the next update in 2012. Now the nexus with the groundwater model is that a significant portion of that management plan is based on model output. So we have two options. Postpone the update 2 to 3 years, waiting for the new model to be available. Or we could embark on a program of updating the sections that don't deal with modeling and then revisit the sections that do deal with modeling at a later date. And I've talked with staff. We're recommending the second option, but we'd like your concurrence with that approach. The second item relates to funding for the modeling project. Now, I'd venture to say that if we had the results of this model review back in the spring time frame, we probably would have just recommended a task in the work plan that put some funding together to support the model update project. Staff views the model as a tool that the agency uses. It's just like our computers. It's something that we need to do our job. Given the timing of the results of the model review and the timing of the GC program coming out, there's been some discussion that maybe if the agency wanted to fund a portion of the model update program, that it'd be better served through the GC program, and certainly that's an option. Staff's recommendation is to treat the any financial assistance for the update project as an agency task, work cooperatively with United. I'll be a big part of that project, obviously, but essentially treat this as another task of the agency and not do it through the grant program, primarily because this is a tool that we use, and it's sort of an awkward situation to grant money to update something that we're using. It doesn't seem consistent to us. So our recommendation is to go down the path of incorporating this into our work plan. We've talked with United staff. We're looking at something on the order of $250,000 over the 3 to 4 year model update process. Talking with Tony, the request might come to you for $50,000 this year and then $100,000 in the other outer years, but that's all still to be determined. What we're looking for is your feedback on how to request that money down the road. Questions?
Excellent. Any members have any questions for Brian before we go to the audience here for a second? Dave.
I guess my question for Jeff and staff is, what does this do to Brian's time? Does this project pull him away from the duties he's been doing for us?
We think that it will, but this is consistent with what we had planned for him.
Oh, it is.
I mean, he's been wandering afield from the modeling, but really we brought him on for the modeling, primarily for the modeling.
I was going to say, I don't remember that, but okay, I'll go with that story for a minute.
Have to check my notes.
Mike?
There were modeling questions in the interview.
But Dave didn't interview you, so it doesn't count, right?
The question I have is, what's the disadvantage? You bypassed the concept of the grant, and I didn't quite understand why that's such a bad plan to try to get a grant.
Yeah, well, I don't think we're saying it's a bad plan. I think it's kind of a timing thing. Like I was saying, if the model project review project had been completed in spring, we probably would have looked at this and said, this is an important tool for the agency, and we're recommending that we fund a portion of the model revision project that United's embarking on, and we do that through a task in the work plan, just like anything else that we do, like the study, the irrigation efficiency study, so on and so forth. What's happened because of the timing is that the results of this revision, or of the review, have come out about the same time that we've embarked on this GC process. And so there's been some discussions that maybe that's where the funding should be moved through. And am I answering your question?
Maybe I can take another shot at that, Brian, if I may. Sure. Our thinking at the staff level was that this is such a significant expense. But when we originally presented the GC to you, we were thinking that it was going to be trickle out at 20, 50,000 at a time. We think that the modeling effort, although it wouldn't do this all at once, is probably going to exceed the contribution we'd be recommending to your board would probably exceed the amounts in the GC over time. So we thought maybe it was better to keep it separate, and that would be our recommendation to you.
Okay. Questions?
So this whole model is just for planning and management of the groundwater system? Not
Yes.
being a new person, you're in.
Yes, it's a planning tool.
Make sure that we plan and manage the water efficiently. So.
It's basically a tool we use to say what's going to happen in the future. If we do this, how are the groundwater basins going to respond? And there's a lot of value in that for decision makers when we're coming up with policies and so on and so forth.
Good. Interesting.
We have debated this issue a lot at United. It's been before United has a groundwater committee. It's been before that committee two times, I guess. It's been in front of the board, and Brian's made essentially the same presentation that you just saw now. He's made to the committee and to the board. And from my standpoint, modeling is the tool of science, and particularly when we're trying to look below the surface, it's the only tool we have. We've got to say, what's reality? Can we mathematically duplicate it so we can predict in the future? And what Brian and the staff at United have essentially told the United Board is the model, although it was useful at a point in time, does not affect reality, and you as a board, we as a board, are being asked to make policy decisions, and we don't know what's going on in our backyard. So from a pure science standpoint, it's the only tool we have within the world of science to deal with this scientific question. And from a policy standpoint, I don't want to be making decisions based on, pie in the sky. Beyond that, I believe that and this is my kind of looking out to the future, I believe that we are going to face down the road a significant challenge on the physical systems that we have in place in our collective water agency. When you look at the environmental issues that United is facing with the Freeman, with the San Felice Dam, with the movement of water, who gets to use that water? I could see very easily some point in time where we're going to get pressure by some entities that say we need to push more water in one direction, essentially out to the ocean, to solve their problems, and we're going to have to go potentially in front of court and argue to the court that every acre foot that goes to the ocean is a real detriment to another environmental issue we have, and it's called our aquifer, and it's our charge to protect that aquifer. If we can't go into that court with the kind of database that we need to be able to scientifically prove our position, it puts us in a very weak position when we have to battle the value of that water that may go to us or may wind up going to the ocean. So I see this process, although it's expensive, we actually got a windfall a number of years ago because the USGS came in and did it for us, and we've piggybacked on that for years. We have piggybacked on the work that United's done over the years, and now we have our own staff person who can work with United and the modeling process to do some things to take us to the next generation. And I believe that that modeling process, if we do it right, if we use the brain trust that I think we've established between our two collective agencies, if we do it right, I think it'll give us better decision making data and potentially put us in a much stronger position when we have to battle, particularly at United, on behalf of all of us, the issues about what percentage of the water should go to the ocean, what percentage of the Freeman needs to be rebuilt, what percentage of the San Felice Dam should go to the ocean, what percentage of the San Felice Dam is in fact a valuable asset for everything within our water system. Right now, my perspective is that the aquifer, which I view as our environmental charge, does not have an equal footing with regards to creatures that somehow they have a higher stake in this than our aquifer does, and we've got to protect that. So I think the presentation today is to essentially have us give staff some direction in this matrix. You had two questions that you want to ask us. Let's go back. Originally, my thought was to postpone the GMA update so that we don't dilute staff's time, but in fact go out and concentrate on doing the modeling, get that core of our management plan out of the way, and everything else kind of falls in place. And and now with staff recommending updating sections without the modeling, personally, I don't understand that logic. I would have thought option one would be a better one, but and I don't know what your collective thought is, and I don't know what the thought of staff is. So, John?
Mr. Chairman, I think Brian mentioned two things initially: scheduling and financing, or financial.
This is the scheduling piece.
The scheduling end of it.
Yes, and to answer, I think you're asking a question. What would we update? Well, we're doing a lot of work on irrigation efficiency, so there's going to be a lot of new information, potentially new policies that can be incorporated into the management plan. And the other thing is we're working on basin-specific management. And the way the management plan is organized right now, it's not very conducive to having a basin management framework. So we could work on redoing the framework to accommodate basin-specific planning. That's another thing.
Okay, all right.
So there's some non-modeling.
Okay, so option two makes sense if you do that. Okay, and the second one, does anybody else have any questions on that option?
The problem that I see, though, is by going your option two, now you're busy doing something else other than modeling, which then delays your modeling by how many years?
I don't know that that's entirely the case. The model update is, the burden is largely borne on United. Now, that's obviously something I'll be participating in, but we do have other staff that can work on the other portions of the management plan, so we can balance our resources, I believe. Jeff?
Yes. I think the work will go in parallel.
Okay. All right.
Well, we're kind of treading water a little bit in the Las Posas, waiting for more modeling information, though, I think. And
yes, that's what we talked about this morning.
Yeah, so, anything that slows down the whole modeling concept, I think, may be not moving as aggressively forward as we might hope.
Well, maybe the way to do it is to take option two and recognize, and it's a staff management process, that if the process of not dealing with the modeling is eaten up by doing other items, we need to shift that priority, because I will tell you that Tony and Brian made a huge pitch to the United board. It's a chunk of change. It's an investment in the future that United's going to make sure that our answers are defensible, or our position is defensible. And so part of the money, we're going to get to that in the issue of the next, part of the money that United is actually funding is to buy expertise to do a lot of the background work that our technical staff does, to release them, to bring the brain power that we have so they can tackle this issue and not be eaten up with side jobs. So to the extent that our staff at the GMA takes the same tack so that we get the modeling done and it doesn't get pushed aside, I think option two works, and it answers your question and my concern as well.
As we're coming under this pressure with regard to the ordinance. with date certain, let's get down the highway. And so the question was asked this morning, we've been talking about this for a long time.
Sure.
I have to remind everybody, it's time to quit talking and start doing.
All right, let's go to the second question you had. All right, well, let's back up. The sense I'm getting from the board, I'm not hearing any people yelling and screaming at me from the audience, is option 2 is the option we'll go with regards to the scheduling and scope.
With the caveat that...
With the caveat, let's not get bogged down in, what's that?
With the caveat of parallel work for GMA staff and the United staff.
Yeah, okay, so let's go to the funding issue.
Okay, so sort of the presumption here is that there may be an opportunity to financially support United's efforts to update the model, recognizing that this is also a tool that the agency uses. And so there were 2 options. One is to fund through the grant program. The second would be to just treat this like another task, like our irrigation efficiency study, for example, and add it to the work plan and come to you with a request for additional funding through that mechanism. So staff is looking for your feedback on which option to proceed with, and the timing is sort of essence because the application deadline for GSEEP is the end of next month. So we are looking for your feedback as to which road to take, because we need to take some action if we're going to request funding.
Dave, what do you want to do?
I have no preference. I think it needs to get paid for. In theory, rolling it into our regular work tasks, we're completing some things, and we may in fact find there's next year's budget may not have some expenditures that we've had in past years, and so it maybe makes sense to include it as a new task.
Okay. Mike?
I agree with that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm okay with that. And the other caveat is that you can always go back at some future date when you have enough lead time to ask specifically for a specific amount under the grant program. It doesn't have to be the full amount. It could be a specific amount for a specific sub-thing that came up that we didn't anticipate.
Right.
So I think the direction right now is roll it into the work plan. I see it as part of the core business that we do, and the grant program will stand available to other entities out there that don't have the kind of resources that United and we have. So we'll just roll it in. Okay? So option 2 is the answer to that. You okay?
I would hope that the Las Posas Users Group continues to see Brian. He's been doing a great job with that whole process and disseminating a lot of good information. And that was my initial, somewhat selfish concern, was coming from the Las Posas, that we'd like to keep him coming.
And I think that's a fair concern. All right. Anything else? Do we get to your answers on this item?
You did.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Very good.
Very well.
Let's go to, we've covered all of the items. We're down to executive officer's report, administrative items. Motion.
Second.
A second. All in favor? Aye. Okay. Next meeting is December 1st, a Wednesday. Anybody from the audience have anything they want? Yes, no, yes, no. And I will not be here December 1st. I don't know how I got that screwed up. What's that? Okay. I know, it's the way my schedule falls in place. Hey, by the way, folks, Happy Turkey Day. We don't see you next month. Bye-bye. And Halloween, yeah. John, thank you very much.